This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and the community in which you now reside.
Okay, my name is John Howard Sandler. I currently live in Harker Heights, Texas, which is outside Fort Hood, Texas, where I retired. I'm just up here on the Cape because my family's owned a house here in Eastham for about 40 years. I've got family up here that I visit during the holidays.
And how did you end up in Texas?
Yep, you got me with that one before. So I was deployed or stationed in Texas starting about 2011. From there I was in Afghanistan for about a year. And when I came back to Texas, I had emptied out my apartment, obviously. And I decided that I had never bought a house before. So I decided I would buy a house. I was in Texas. That's where I bought my house. And eventually I'll probably move back up here to New England because that's where I'm from originally. But for now, I'm just kind of enjoying my time down in Texas.
So what influenced you to enlist?
So I was actually working on Cape Cod construction for someone you know, as a matter of fact. This was back in after I graduated college, so this would have been about 1989. I was here for about 3 years. And it was the first Gulf War had started. If you don't remember that, because you probably weren't born, either one of you, Iraq had invaded Kuwait. It's all about oil. The United States formed a coalition, and they were going to push Iraq back out of Kuwait. And I was watching television one night or over the course of a few nights, and what I found very interesting were there were some stories about in the news that referenced that re-enlistment rates were down, enlistment rates were down, the number of people claiming what's called conscientious objectorship, they don't think they can actually kill someone, had gone up. And that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I just decided that, I didn't want to live in a country where whether I am capable of achieving everything certainly gives you the opportunity to do so, and the only thing I had done was pay taxes. So I decided to enlist, and initially it was for 2 years. 24 years later, I was done.
What was your family's reaction to your enlistment?
Positive. I think obviously everybody, any parent would be concerned, when their kid joins the military for obvious reasons, and especially because this was a time when clearly the United States with its coalition was going to go to war unless Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, had left on his own volition, which did not happen. So there's concern, but there's also pride. There were really no negative reactions.
What was boot camp like?
Basic training, yeah, that was, it's interesting. It's very regimented, very structured. It's a whole new world. It's nothing that you thought you would have experienced before. I enjoyed it, actually, because it was very disciplined. I love to exercise. There's a lot of exercise. There's a lot of, you're treated very harshly. I think basic training has changed a lot over the last couple of decades, actually. It's tried to become more, say, user-friendly and, dare I say, even more politically correct. They have these things called stress cards where if you're really stressed out, you just give your drill sergeant this card, kind of get a quick timeout or something. But the initial concept for basic training was to almost break or force the civilian out of you and make you think that you are just a soldier and a member of the Army.
So what were you thinking during your time at boot camp and even when you went off for the first time?
Well, I'll answer the second part of the question, the first part. I'm not certain that I was thinking much of anything. Like I said, it's extremely regimented. It can be very physical. I think you get up, I don't even recall because again, it's been almost 30 years now, but you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you're yelled at when you get out, at least when I was in basic training. The drill sergeants come in, there's a lot of yelling to get the hell out of bed, out of the bunk, get ready. Do personal hygiene real quick when she's just, shave and brush your teeth, get on your PT uniform, you go downstairs, you're in formation, and from then on, physical training, and then whatever is done during the day. There's not a lot of talking initially, so that goes through until whatever time, 9 o'clock at night, and then 2100, I would say, and then it's lights out, and you just kind of fall asleep. So that's an interesting question I've never thought about. I think afterwards you reflect on it, but certainly at the time, especially for the first few weeks, and my boot camp was about 13 weeks long, you're just trying to make it through the day, thinking, why did I do this? And what other horrible surprises do they have for me?
So what was your happiest memory through your time serving?
Happy. I wouldn't say happy, not that I was unhappy. I enjoyed my time in the military enormously. There were times where it was just great, and I was happy. You know, there's a lot of camaraderie and all these things, and I always liked deploying combat scenarios, etc. There's also a lot of negatives to it. I mean, the hours can be really long. It can be very dangerous. But I don't have really one specific thing like this made me really happy. I was happy to get through basic training. I was happy to get through Rangers. Anytime you graduate a military school, satisfaction, for lack of a better word, I don't know, maybe happiness. But overall, I enjoyed it. I have very few bad memories in the military.
That leads us to our next question.
See?
What was one of your saddest memories?
Same thing applies. I just can't give you any sad memories. I mean, I was, my first deployment in Iraq, I had a couple of soldiers killed, some wounded, and that's obviously sad in that sense. The same thing when I deployed to Afghanistan. But it just comes with the territory, and you just kind of get through it.
Where was your favorite place that you served?
Anytime I was deployed in a combat theater. So I did one tour in Iraq, that was about 05, 06, and then one in Afghanistan 08 to 09, and then the second one in Afghanistan, which I think was 2011 to 2012. It's what I came in the military to do, not just to draw a paycheck and sit in the barracks all day, to do what I was trained to do. So that's what I enjoyed the most.
Describe a day while you were serving, just an average day.
That's interesting because I suppose there is an average day. So you get up in the morning, you go to work, you're in formation, you do physical training, PT, for an hour. That's not always, there are times that there are other things going on, but generally Monday through Friday, if there's nothing else going on, that's what you do. So an hour and a half of physical training. Then you have about an hour to go eat breakfast, shower, do whatever. You go back to formation probably about 9 o'clock. And then from 9 o'clock until about 5 o'clock, you're doing what's on the training schedule. I mean, on any given day, maybe you go to the firing range for marksmanship. Maybe you're doing a land navigation course. Maybe you're taking any number of, what's called 350-1 mandatory classes. Sexual harassment classes or equal opportunity classes, or maybe it's just, water survival skills or something like that. So it's really hard to say if I don't think there's any average day, and a lot of it depends on what's coming up. So I think a lot of people tend to think that, particularly in the Army, and particularly what I did was an infantry soldier, both an NCO and an officer, is you're just in the woods all day, trading, shooting things, sleeping, camping out overnight, and it's not like that at all. Part of that is just budgetary. God knows we'd love to go to the range every day and fire bullets, but that's just not the way that it works. So that kind of has to be resourced out. So if you come up on, say, deployment orders, let's say your unit is alerted that you're going to go to Afghanistan, you've got plenty of lead time, usually about 6 months to 9 months, come down on the patch chart, then your kind of field time training to get you in what's called a band of excellence kind of ramps up. But then after that, you're not always in the field all the time, training.
Describe some of your responsibilities as a major.
Again, that kind of depends on what you're doing. So when I was promoted to major, I was stationed in Fort Polk, Louisiana, at what's called JRTC, Joint Readiness Training Center, which is one of the two major training centers in the United States. The other one's NTC out in California. And you go there, what I was called an OC, Observer Controller. So units that are getting ready to go to war, that are on the patch chart, show up and they go through about a month's worth of very intensive field training for that particular theater where they're going to deploy. And while they're in the box, so to speak, out training as an observer controller, I shadow them. My peers and I would shadow them, and we give them what are called, AARs, after action review. So kind of after, when the exercise is over, We talk about, okay, what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, and how can we make ourselves better so we don't make the same mistakes in combat. So that's one thing I did as a major. I also deployed as a major as an advisor. You know, one of the big things that were happening in Iraq and Afghanistan was not that we would be so much in the fight, but that we were training the host national forces, i.e. the Iraqis or the Afghans, to do the fighting. So we would go there and train them. So I went at one point where I had a logistician, a human resources guy, medical personnel, commo people, myself, and we would fall in with our counterparts within the Afghan army and kind of get them to understand how best practices, how we do things, so they can be better as an organization. So again, I have, you know, multiple different jobs and responsibilities as a major, so there's really no one correct answer.
Okay. How long did you have to go without communications with your family while you were serving?
Not long. You know, that changes a lot. My first deployment was for about 2 months, and that was in Haiti, and that would have been about 94. This is before, and I know it's difficult for you to imagine, nobody had cell phones. We didn't really use, you know, the internet, social media, all those things. So they would have, you know, USO trailers set up, and they would have phones in there, and you could go and use the phones and call home. And depending on how busy you were, it depended on how often you could use them. And again, say in Haiti, there might be, you know, 1,000 people who are on that particular base or camp, and there's very limited communication. So you're, you know, it's not like you're really going in there every day or every week. I was not married. I'm not married now, so it's, you know, I didn't have this driving need that I had to get on the phone and talk, you know, call back to my wife and kids or something like that. It was just generally my parents. Fast forward to, you know, the last 10 years, you know, my first deployment to Iraq was kind of the same. Nobody really had cell phones. People were starting to have sat phones, satellite phones, but that was still pretty unusual. But there was more internet connectivity, so you could get on Yahoo or what have you if you had downtime. And now you go up to, you know, my last two deployments, which were 2008, 2009, and then I think 2011, 2012 in Afghanistan. Soldiers have cell phones, and that's a problem for operational security reasons and all those things. But, you know, unless a soldier is out on a particular mission, there's really nothing that, time changes allowing, that prevents him or her from just dialing their phone and calling whoever they want. So it's very interesting. The Army kind of struggles with it all the time.
So in your first deployment, when you would call home, what would you be feeling when you did that, or when you had to hang up?
You know, again, it's like I didn't have like young kids that, you know, Daddy, I miss you or anything like that. I mean, I joined the military when I was 26, so my first deployment I was 30. My parents were in their 60s. So this is not a lot of trauma or drama in my case. You know, I'm only, you know, I can't speak for anybody else. So to me, it was really no big deal. Especially if you think you're going to come home, it's just a matter of, well, I'll be home in a couple of months. You know, it's usually like, I'll never see you again, because nobody wants to think that way.
So what was your scariest memory from the military?
Let's see, scariest deployment-wise. You know, I'll tell you something. I spent 8 years as a combat arms NCO, and then whatever the math gets me to 24 years, you know, 14 years or so as a major, also infantry. Thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of training in every possible scenario, you know, as an infantry guy. I don't get scared. I shouldn't say that. I don't mean that in a boastful way. You know, if I walk out the door right now and somebody says, "Boo!" yeah, I'm going to be startled or scared. But in any combat scenario, I think for the most part, people are trained so well that even when things are kind of exploding around me, you have a job to do, so you're really not thinking about being afraid. I would be more fearful, strangely enough, in training environments than I ever was in a combat environment. Jumping out of airplanes, you know, when I was airborne qualified, that kind of thing. But I don't remember, certainly in a combat environment, ever really feeling any particular fear.
Why did you choose the Army out of any branch?
Yep, that's a great point. I guess it goes back to my earlier statement, is that what I was watching on television about enlistments going down and re-enlistments, I think they were talking specifically about the Army because it was the Army, as well as the Marines probably, that were going to go to Iraq, not so much the Navy for obvious reasons, and then the Air Force is the Air Force, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way. My father had also served in the military in the Korean War back, 1951 or 52. So there was kind of that in my head as well. But I decided that if I was going to serve the country in the military, at the time I knew as little about the military as probably, I would assume, either of you two. So when people think the military, probably the first thing that pops in their mind is the Army, right? And so that kind of led me there. And if I wanted to be a soldier, it was to, I hate to say fight, but in a combat environment, that makes you think infantry, which makes you think Army. So I didn't want to be a cook. Nothing wrong with military cooks. Didn't want to be a mechanic. I wanted to be an infantry guy.
What was the most difficult decision you had to make during your time serving?
I don't know. Again, you make decisions all the time. And, again, for the most part, let's talk about, combat deployments, mission planning. I mean, people think, again, that you go in, the Army, you just go out in the woods and you train all day and you fight. I think that's what they think the Army does well. What the Army would tell you, I think, what they do the best and the most of is they plan. So everything kind of has a plan, and it's very formatted, it's very regimented how you go about doing it. Doesn't mean that it's going to be the right answer or the correct thing to do. But that's why I really don't have much of an answer for that question.
What was friendship like during your time serving?
Yeah, this is interesting. There's obviously an enormous sense of camaraderie in the military. Suffering builds bonds. There's no question about it. But the interesting thing about it too is, when I was 24 years in the military, I moved 16 different times. So in the one respect, when you are in a unit, they're usually very closely bonded together. You get along with people. You'll do anything for them within reason, etc. But the interesting aside to that is that at some point, everybody moves. So, 24 years, I was 16 different locations for anywhere from, maybe 3 months up to, 6 or 7 years or so, usually about 2 or 3 years. So I would think because of the nature of what you do and how physically difficult it can be, either deployed or in training, but also the hours that you spend together, and they are extremely long, you can build some really close knit relationships.
Was there anyone in particular that you built a close relationship with?
Not really. I mean, I would, have friends in the military at a particular duty station. But, one other thing is I joined late. And so I was generally always older than my peers, or not my peers, but the people I lived with. And then I went to OCS, Officer Candidate School, and became an officer. But I went when I was, I think, 32. And of course, was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Most officers, are commissioned either out of West Point, out of ROTC or something like that. So they're generally 22 or 24 years old. So in that perspective, I've always been older than my peers, so to speak. So I get along with them, but I wouldn't say that I have one particularly close one.
What was your proudest moment?
Okay, I'll tell you. I graduated, airborne school, ranger school, survived my deployments, led my soldiers well. But a few years after I finished up at Fort Drum, where I'd been a squad leader before I was commissioned, I had one of my soldiers who was out of the military reach out to me. And again, this is before cell phones and all this kind of stuff. So he contacted my parents who were living here at the time on the Cape, found my email address, my military email address, and he wrote me this email in which he thanked me for how tough I was on him and how, sometimes he hated me. maybe he didn't say hate, but he thought I was unfair, but he realized I was just trying to make him better. And he referenced a time I had, he was roped in, okay, but I had basically thrown him off a roof. We were rappelling. He did not want to do it. It would have been perfectly safe. He was kind of a scaredy cat at the time. So I basically physically manhandled him over the roof. And then he rappelled down. It was a little sloppy, but he came bounding back up the stairs and he was like, Sergeant, I want to do that again. So he went back down. And in the letter, he referenced that. And he said, I remember how scared I was when you basically threw me off the roof. But that gave me the courage to do it again. And that gave me the courage to go to airborne school and become a squad leader, in my own right in time. And at the time, he'd gotten out of the military, and he was a narcotics detective in either the Bronx or Brooklyn, New York. So the fact that you can have that much, just doing your job, doing the right thing, but you can have so much of a positive impact on someone, I think that would probably be my proudest moment. Not surviving deployments or things like that.
What was your biggest health scare during your time serving?
Health scare?
Yes.
I don't have any health scares. I've had stuff fired at me and stuff blown up around me. I will tell you an amusing story, if you don't mind. Okay, so I'm at Fort Polk, Louisiana. I had to go in for my over 40 physical. I think I was 44, so they obviously they missed me by a few years. So I go in, and they do all the things that they normally do for a physical, including putting all these monitors on you, and then you got to lie quiet for 10 EKG or ECG. I'm not even sure what it's called. And the next day I get home from work, and there's a message on the answering machine, and they said, was it Captain or Major at the time? Probably Major. Major saying, oh, this is so and such hospital. We've had an issue with your heart readout, and we need you to call us back. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have a heart attack, or I have a heart disease, or whatever the case may be. So I call them up, and I said, this is who I am. I got this message from you. What's the problem? They said, well, there were some abnormalities in your readout, so we need you to come back in and redo it. I'm like, well, what are the abnormalities? And they said, well, we can't tell you over the phone, confidentiality agreements and all that kind of stuff. So I go in, and all it was it's very typical, is when they put the little monitors, electrodes on you, what have you, and maybe they don't affix correctly, so they're not able to get perfectly routine thing. And I told the doctor, I'm like, that is crazy. I was sitting at home thinking I'm about to die. You couldn't at least give me a heads up. Now that may be odd, given that I've jumped out of airplanes, been to Ranger School, and been on combat deployments, but for some reason, just as an amusing thing, that was probably, strangely enough, the biggest health scare I had in the military in 24 years. Unless something else comes to mind.
Define a hero.
Interesting. A hero is someone who does not just the things that other people won't do, but the right things that other people won't do. And I think what goes with that is obviously, some kind of risk, whether it's personal, professional, or something like that.
What experience from your service affects you the most today?
So there's a doctrinal definition for not just the Army, but all of the services, Navy, Air Force, Marine, etc. And I don't remember it verbatim right now, but it'll say something like about the Army, the ground-based component of the armed forces, tasked with conducting operations on land in support of national security values, something like that, national security interests. But there's another way that the Army defines itself, and I think the other services are probably the same. For the Army, it's called the Army Values, which spell out the acronym LEADERSHIP, LDR-SHIP. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Okay? The fact that I have no piece of paper in front of me, okay, that I could reel that off in my sleep. That's what's impacted me the most, is to be a positive part of something bigger than yourself. I think that's what's impacted me the most. Just kind of be a team player, do things more for others than yourselves, be willing to assume personal risk in support of the things that you believe in.
How did you feel when you came back from war for the very last time?
Well, I didn't know it was the very last time at the time, because I still stayed in for another few years before I decided to retire. Like I said before, I like being deployed. I'm not married. I don't have kids. So that, to me, when I'm deployed in a combat environment, that's where I'm supposed to be. But that being said, a year's deployment is a long time. There's a lot of danger involved with that. You do without a lot of the things that we're used to every day. And I'll tell you another strange story, if you don't mind. like people, when they want to get back to their loved ones or they want to do this thing or that thing. Strangely enough, one of the things that I enjoyed the most coming back from a deployment was in the military. Of course, even deployed, you take showers. But you're generally standing on like a wooden pallet and you should be wearing shower shoes, shower shoes, flip-flops, right? Because, there's a lot of people going through the showers and all that kind of thing. And you just, you don't want to get foot fungus or anything like that. But oddly enough, and I've felt this all 3 times that I've come back from a deployment, was when I could finally stand in a shower with my bare feet. I know that's odd, just like the other story about the health scare, but that's just the way it is.
How often do you think back to your wartime?
Wartime or service in general?
Service in general.
Because they're really about the same. Fairly often, but I'm a pretty introspective person, so I think about a lot of things. And because 24 of my 54 years has been spent in the military, my most formative time, that's probably what I think back on a lot. I don't dwell on it. I don't not regret, but it's not that I miss it either. I think maybe if I'd only been in 4 years or 6 years and had been forced out, against my will or something like that, I might think differently. But what's interesting is that I don't really miss it. Occasionally I'll hear, again, I live down in Harker Heights, Texas, outside Fort Hood, which is one of the largest U.S. Army posts in the States. So sometimes when I hear a helicopter or see, a couple of UH-60s or a CH-47, which are helicopters, and think about air assault operations that I've been on and that I kind of miss. But other than that, I don't miss it too much. I did what I needed to do.
What advice would you give someone who's going to enlist in the military?
I would say, and the beauty of the internet today is you can research. You got to make sure you're getting correct information. You're going to good websites. Is to find out as much as you can about what particular service you want to go into and why you want to go into it. So you kind of have an understanding of what you're going into. I personally believe in public service. I don't think it has to be military. I think it could be Peace Corps or Vista or any number of things. But I think at some point, everybody should do something for their country instead of just, doing your own thing. But I would definitely say research it and make sure that it's what you want. And then stick with it. I don't know what the attrition rate is in the Army, but it's pretty high of people that just don't make it through their first enlistment. They just quit, which is never a good thing. And it's, whether it's 2 years or 4 years, I think if you make the decision to go in, finish it. Because if you don't, I think that's the kind of thing when you really come to adulthood, you're going to look back and kind of regret that you didn't have the internal fortitude to finish.
How did your time serving change the way that you view life now?
Okay, I'm going to give you an honest answer to this. So I did 3 combat deployments. They were each a year long, and I've already laid out the years where I went. And although these days, again, you do have social media and all these, you're really kind of cut off in many ways from home. And maybe it's just the way I am as a soldier or as a person, but I will tell you that every time I came back to the States, I was a little more disappointed in my fellow Americans. I just find that they are increasingly self-righteous, self-entitled, discourteous, and maybe that's just old guy talk, but you asked, so I answered.
How do you feel about the people of the country that you fought against?
Oh, it's interesting. That's an interesting question because, in a lot of previous wars, take World War II, for example, nobody really differentiated between, say, Japan, the Japanese military and the Japanese civilians, German military and German civilians. They were all kind of part and parcel the same. But what's interesting is where I've deployed, Iraq, it was already known that a lot of the Iraqi people did not like Saddam Hussein. In Afghanistan, the same way. A lot of Afghans are anti-Taliban. So I'm there fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, but not the Afghan people. And in Iraq, I'm fighting, the terrorists, the remnants of Saddam Hussein's supporters, but not the population at large. Other than people look at the IEDs and SVBIDs and all that kind of thing, terrorists they call them, but they endure a lot of suffering on their own. I actually have a lot of respect for them.